My name is Ida DeBeery from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and I have the privilege of introducing today's webinar. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for ICTs, and we are also the core organizers of the AI for Good Global Summit, alongside the X Prize Foundation, in partnership with 38 UN sister agencies and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of the Sustainable Development Goals and scale the solutions for global impact. We are pleased today to discuss a regulatory framework for automated driving, the value of in-use data for creating a no-blame culture of safety. This webinar is part of the ITUT's focus group on AI for automated and assisted driving, which was generated from the 2019 AI Summit in Geneva. And then now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Bryn Balcom. He is the chairman of the ITUT focus group on AI for autonomous and assisted driving, and he is the founder of the Autonomous Drivers Alliance. Over to you, Bryn.
Thanks very much, Ada. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, the focus group that we run within the ITU started at the AI for Good Summit, so it's great to be actually sharing this webinar with them as well. We'll also be joined by the Law Commissions of England and Wales and the Scottish Law Commission as well in this webinar, which will be looking particularly at the Law Commission's consultation paper, their third consultation paper, detailing the regulatory framework for automated driving. So it's a consultation. The aim of this workshop is to get good interaction with all the audience and between all of the panelists. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our panelists. I think first we'll just start with our names. So my name's Bryn. I think I said London is where I'm based. 2027 is when I think autonomy will be here. And I'm really passionate around the safety and the inclusion aspects that autonomy can bring to the road. So Jessica, if you'd like to just introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Guccioni, and I'm with the Law Commission. Let's see, the year I predicted was 2030 in terms of using AVs, and I'm in London, but I'm Italian, so I guess my heart is there. So that's where I would also call home. Thanks, and it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much for joining. Connor?
Hi, my name's Connor. I'm also a lawyer at the Law Commission of England and Wales. I predicted 2028, at least for some automated features. I think 2028 is when I'll be seeing them. And I'm based in and around London.
Super. And Lizzie as well.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm a legal assistant at the Scottish Law Commission. I think my guess is around 2030 as well, although I can be wrong, can be sooner. And I'm based in Glasgow, although our Scottish Law Commission is actually based in Edinburgh.
Excellent. And then we have some, as we said, distinguished experts that are also joining the Law Commission panelists. So we have Nick Reed.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Nick Reed. I'm the founder of Reed Mobility. I was one of the expert group that provided recommendations to the European Commission on the ethics of connected and automated vehicles. So very happy to join the discussion today. I guess, you know, the question isn't necessarily when, but where we'll encounter automated vehicles. So there are some operating already. I've led trials of some in the UK. When we'll see them on the streets of London, could be a while yet.
Ninke, are you there?
Hi everyone, my name is Nienke Vanninga. I'm a postdoc researcher at the law faculty of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Sorry, I am based in Groningen and I hope to see self-driving cars in 2030, but with so many cyclists on the road here, I'm probably a bit too optimistic, unfortunately.
Yeah, very true, very true. And finally, last but not least, Siddhartha, either.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Siddhartha Kastagi, Head of Verification and Validation at WMG at the University of Warwick in the UK. I actually can't predict when autonomous vehicles will be there because I first would like to know what autonomous vehicles are we talking about. So depending upon the application, the years would be very different. And I think we are going to talk a lot about that during the conversation today. So I'm based in Coventry in the UK.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. It depends is a very interesting answer to that question normally. Throughout the workshop, we'll be using two types of framing devices. If you've attended any of the ITU focus group meetings that we've run before, you'll be familiar with the first one, which is the Molly problem. So the Molly problem is a thought experiment. It considers a young girl called Molly is crossing the road alone and is hit by an unoccupied self-driving vehicle. There are no eyewitnesses. What would you expect to happen next? Both in terms of the behavior of the vehicle, the data that might be recorded to establish what happened and then lead to some learning that comes after that event. We'll make some adaptations to this because obviously when we originally focused on the Molly problem, we spoke about unoccupied self-driving vehicles, and that has a particular definition, which we'll come on to with the Law Commission report. We'll extend that to include user in charge, another term that you'll come to hear, and then maybe assisted driving as well. But the basic premise will be the same. You know, a collision event occurs, who will be responsible for their various different steps within that process. The second framing device will focus on a family driving scenario, a self-driving family, as I've called them. And this is kind of mirrored in some ways in the way I thought, if I had a self-driving vehicle, how would I use it? So yes, I could do the commute in the morning to the train station, but then I want to send the car home so my wife and my daughter can use it, and my wife and my daughter can then go to school, go into town to work, and then maybe, and this is something that Tesla has obviously been promoting for a long time, I can then, you know, my wife can then enable a robo-taxi ride service using our vehicle. So we could, if we wanted to, allow that to be subscribed to a robo-taxi fleet, and then it continually drives around town offering rides to other people. So each of those journeys we'll go through in detail later. They each have different, bring out different elements of the Law Commission's proposed legal framework that we'll be discussing today. But I think that will end up with some fascinating discussions. So first of all, we'll talk about the Noblame Safety Culture, but before we get into detail on that, I'd like to invite Lizzie from the Scottish Law Commission to just give a little introduction as to who the Law Commission are, what the consultation is about, and just some framing about what the outcomes from the consultation should be. So Lizzie, I'll stop my sharing now.
I'm just going to pull up the slides just now, if you just bear with me, and then I'll be handing over to my colleague Jessica to take you through the first few sections.
Thanks so much, Lizzie. Hi, everyone. So as I mentioned, we've got quite a few colleagues here from the Law Commission. And Lizzie, if you can go to the next slide, please. Many of you may not be familiar with the Law Commission as an organisation. We're basically advisors to the UK government. So we're an independent entity set up by Parliament to keep the law of England and Wales and Scotland under review and modern and up to date and functional and efficient. So that's our statutory duty that we have. And it was like set up in 1965. So it's not a specific body just for automated vehicles. It's a general purpose organization dealing with changes to law and law reform. So basically, we have been asked by the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles in the UK to advise about what we need to do to change in terms of legislation to enable the deployment of self-driving vehicles. And I was interested to see in the chat, many people highlighted it's really difficult and important to be clear what we mean by self-driving vehicles. So that's absolutely one of the questions that we ourselves are tackling from a legal point of view, identifying the scope and remit of what it means to be self-driving. So that is in itself a question which should not be assumed and needs to be discussed and be transparent. We started our work in 2018 and we've done 2 rounds of consultation already. We've done consultation and analysis in respect of big policy questions around safety, around legal responsibility, and we're currently in a current cycle, in the last cycle of consultation. So that's happening right now. And the consultation started at the end of December and it will be continuing until mid-March. So there's still a chance to share your views if you should wish to get involved. We would really welcome that. And the outputs from our work are going to be recommendations for legal change at the end of this year. And the idea is that government would then be in a position to identify whether it wishes to take them forward, and it would be possible to do so from 2022 onwards. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Yes. So just in terms of overview, I mentioned the meaning of self-driving, which many of you also highlighted as being crucial. How do we deal with systems that require human intervention? What kinds of environments do they need to be able to tackle? That's the kind of questions we consider as part of the legal remit of self-driving, and also the important threshold question of how safe is safe enough. Because someone needs to make that determination. We also consider the safety approval scheme, both before the vehicle is allowed onto our roads to begin with, as well as ongoing safety. So that's something that we consider, and I think that's the heart of what we're suggesting. It's a real priority to get a good system in place that can make sure that we have an appropriate safety assurance scheme for automated vehicles. And as part of that, what we're seeking to contribute is identifying the different legal responsibilities and actors that are needed to make this possible. So we look at users of automated vehicles and what kinds of responsibilities we might place on them, as well as fleet operators, which we see as another very important element. In addition to the role of manufacturers and developers, of course, of this technology, which are actually putting it forward for approval. So those are some of the key players. And then we consider civil and criminal responsibilities. The criminal side is particularly challenging because you can't just contract out of it. The criminal responsibilities cannot simply be passed on. So we have to be very mindful of where they arise already and what we want for the future, essentially, and how we do move to that no-blame safety culture that Bryn was highlighting as being a very core part of what we're suggesting. And finally, data. We've got a very narrow take on data. We're just focusing on the data that is absolutely necessary to make the safety assurance scheme work. So we're not looking at the wider implications and economic benefits of data and things like intellectual property in data. Those are incredibly important and need to be dealt with, and government is looking at those directly. We're trying to take a more focused approach and identify the bare minimum that we need to make sure we have a functional and operative safety assurance scheme. So I think
that's great. That's great, Jessica. I think there's obviously a lot in there, because effectively your report is 390 pages long, I believe, the full report. So it's an incredible body of work. I have to admit, I've read the 57-page summary, which is in itself a really good body of work. I'd recommend everyone to go through that. Hopefully this session will give you an overview without you having to do the reading. But yeah, I really appreciate your time on going through that high level. I'm just going to share my screen again briefly. So it's a no-blame safety culture was really interesting to see, Jessica, as a term. Where did that originate? Because I believe there are some other industries that kind of operate this type of framework.
Absolutely, yeah. So we took a lot of inspiration and knowledge from especially aviation, I guess, in terms of dealing with incidents. And the RAC Foundation has been doing a lot of research in respect of how we might deal better with road casualties, even here in the UK. And it's just the basic premise that you're focusing on how to fix things and make them better for the future, rather than a more retrospective look at identifying what went wrong in the past. Although we are, of course, not saying that that's not important. And I actually think that's going to be a really big challenge for automated vehicles, is how we get society to come along with us on this journey and accept a certain degree of fatalities will still occur, because it's not possible to completely eradicate them, and making sure that they feel that these casualties, when they might and will happen, are dealt with in a way that is acceptable to them, and it doesn't look like a big corporation is getting away with murder. I think that is going to be one of the big societal acceptance challenges. We are certainly focusing on a safe systems approach where we're trying to make sure that we identify problems, fix them, and build that into future standards. So that's what we're trying to focus on, and very much looking at aviation is probably the main one, but there's also in rail and maritime, you have similar approaches.
Yeah, and I believe it was as you mentioned, in the airline industry, the idea of sharing data from collisions or from incidents that's done in a no blame manner. So you give over that information, and it's not the intent is that everybody can learn from those mistakes, and therefore the industry itself overall becomes safer. I think that principle is really interesting to follow. So, Siddhartha, just to get your view on that, what does a no blame safety culture mean to you? Like when you saw those words, did it make sense, or did you feel there was some conflict there? Or?
I think from my perspective, that's essentially the target that we need to be focusing on. But there are a lot of assumptions around a Noblame safety culture, around the different stakeholders that are part of this whole CAV ecosystem, which involves the likes of manufacturers defining what we call as the operational design domain in a fairly accurate manner, the likes of regulators understanding and also communicating and agreeing that operational design domain, which is in aligned with the manufacturers as well as the tier 1 suppliers and local authorities. So there's a lot of assumptions around this concept of no blame safety culture, but that essentially is what we need to be focusing on, because we're not going to move the barrier of knowledge if we keep assigning blame on one stakeholder and another stakeholder. So it's all about collaboration. But again, at the part of it, every stakeholder in this ecosystem has its role, and we need to start defining those roles, and then only we will be able to achieve a no blame safety culture.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating to me, because the first time when you start to work through some problems, the first thing you do is look for blame. You look for who's liable. And it's a very interesting mindset to just go beyond the, okay, well, who's responsible, let's say, for that area? And then what do I want to impose in order to make sure that there's some improvements going forward? And I think, Ninke, you've obviously done a lot of work for us in the focus group of looking at liability cultures, looking at regulatory frameworks. You know, what would your view be on the essentials to a no blame safety culture?
Of course, the idea of a no blame safety culture is very interesting, but it's also very challenging for a lawyer. Like you said, we always look for who to blame and who's responsible, who's going to pay for the damage, who gets a fine, things like that. So I think one of the things that needs to be very clear for this to work is how this no blame safety culture can be combined with the existing legal framework. How the existing legal framework needs to be adapted to make sure that criminal liability, for instance, is no longer an issue, but still if something goes wrong, someone will get an incentive to behave correctly, basically. So that's very interesting from a lawyer's perspective.
Yeah, and Nick, from the ethics perspective, from the work that you did with the European Commission, how does a no blame safety culture fit into that overall ethics around CAV, connected and automated vehicles, in the work that you did?
Yeah, it fits very well, but the answers given are very reflective of the discussions we had in producing those recommendations for the European Commission. So the recommendations split into 3 categories: safety, data, and responsibility. So there was a whole section looking at responsibility, and yeah, trying to get away from blame but focus on accountability and traceability of why incidents have occurred, reflecting that there may need to be adaptations to the legal framework to give everyone the confidence that accountability, that traceability can be achieved. And then there was also a big focus on the safety culture of the developer organizations. So making sure the organizations developing the technology have the right culture in place to ensure that the reasons for an incident can be traced, but also that accountability works appropriately.
Yeah, I think that was obviously one of the themes that came out of the NTSB's investigation on the Elaine Hertzberg fatality, the Uber test vehicle, was it went into a significant amount of detail, not just on the, let's say, the software system, the vehicle system, but the surrounding infrastructure, regulatory structure, but also the culture within the company. And that certainly led to an acceleration of the development of safety cases, for example, much more concrete, definitions and arguments for why your system's designed in a certain way. Yeah,
I think there's also some learnings from the 737 incidents and the cultures that have emerged around those crashes.
Yeah, super. Jessica, I had one. I have a list of questions here. We'll come back to those. But I just pulled this out from the Automated Electric Vehicles Act. So there is some regulation already that's been adopted that in the UK that defines, really loosely defines, let's say, what an automated vehicle is, what self-driving is. So this is designed or adapted to be capable in at least some circumstances or situations of safely driving themselves. And I think you picked out the word safely within your report. Is kind of the key term. Is what does safely driving themselves actually mean?
Exactly, yes. Mm-hmm. So I think,
do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, as you know, currently in the UK, we don't have a permit scheme in order to put a self-driving vehicle on the road. One can do testing, and there's just a very general mandate in our code of practice that's been issued by the Centre for Connected Autonomous Vehicles to comply with the law. So you're able to put a vehicle, in theory, that may not have a human driver as we know them today, provided that you are able to comply nonetheless with all the different obligations. And that is the sort of baseline that we have. The Automated Electric Vehicles Act 2018 puts together a legal framework for insurance, because of course one has to have appropriate insurance to put a vehicle on the road. And in the UK, we insure drivers. So of course that's an issue. You wouldn't be able to have a vehicle that's properly insured if it didn't have a driver. So what the Act does is create a specific scheme for automated vehicles, saying that obviously the insurance attaches to the vehicle itself, like it does in many other jurisdictions anyway, but that's a novelty for the UK. And in order to qualify for this Act, basically the definition of self-driving is this ability to safely drive itself in at least some circumstances or situations, which broadly maps onto the ODD. That's how I read the some circumstances or situations. And then safely driving itself, that goes to what, when we think about SAE terms, you're thinking about the dynamic driving task and the ability to conduct that entirely through the automated driving system. And that brings in itself some questions about the extent to which you can rely on a human as a fallback, for example. So those are just some of the things that come up, but it's very clear from the wording of the Act that if a system requires monitoring from an individual in the vehicle in order to function, then it does not meet the definition. And that is very consistent with what the SAE levels say in terms of object and event detection and response. So I see it as very compatible with the SAE terminology in that sense.
Yeah, and designed or adapted kind of means like retrofit to an existing vehicle that may have already been, let's say, type approved or homologated, or designed is a bespoke vehicle. It could be a completely new vehicle with fully integrated equipment. So both those options exist here in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yes.
Yeah, super. And Siddhartha, you're my go-to ODD expert. So when it comes to circumstances and situations, when you see those words there and you think about ODD, what are we really talking about? What would be covered in your mind for those circumstances or situations?
Thanks, Brenda. Thanks for embarrassing me also a bit over there. But just on this aspect, I think a key part of circumstance and situation is the concept of defining what the system can and cannot do. So when we're trying to define a no blame culture, we are essentially saying this is what a system can do in a particular environment. So you're combining what we call as operational design domain or the operating conditions, and also the behavior of the vehicle. And that's a very interesting part that is often left out of these conversations of safety and trying to define the safety of a system. So it's defining the operating conditions, which includes some things like these static objects around the autonomous vehicle, the weather elements, the kinds of traffic participants that it might be experiencing, and more importantly, how the system would behave in response to that particular operating condition. So it's not only ODD itself, but it's also the behavior in that ODD that together will form a safe system. And this whole thing would be caveated by a set of assumptions that we have on the other entities in that scene. So you cannot define a safe system if you do not have a set of assumptions on other actors or other the weather and the traffic around the autonomous vehicle. So it's a combination of ODD, behavior, and also the assumptions that we need to take into consideration.
Yeah, okay. And so I normally start, with,
if I may
you
jump
could define.
in.
Yeah, Jessica, yeah, please.
Yeah, because I think Siddhartha makes, like, it's a really big point actually from our point of view when we were considering this, because the difference with roads, because that's what we've been asked to do, is allow the deployment on roads, which is a very broad legal concept. It also encompasses the sidewalk, the pavement, for example, from a legal point of view. So it's basically public roads, public spaces. And the idea is that actually roads are chaotic, they're open systems, and that's what I see as the biggest challenge, is that we all have a right to use the roads, and they're not just necessarily for moving around, but there's also political demonstrations that happen in them. You can have stalls for markets, and all sorts of different things happen on roads. And what I think is possibly a danger is that we might be seeking to constrain and somehow adapt, say adding jaywalking laws was something that I know at the beginning of our consultation was something people were considering might be needed, so that you could more constrain what you could predict people to do. I mean, there's questions with that anyway, because obviously you have to be able to deal with other people breaking the law as well. That's part of our obligation as good drivers. So even if somebody has lost control of their vehicle, for whatever reason, you don't just plow into them because they're wrong. You still have an obligation to avoid them. If a cyclist is having difficulty and they're not where they're supposed to be, you still need to avoid them. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges if we think of road as that kind of open environment. If we put constraints on the road and say it's a dedicated way with excluding certain actors from it in a very prescriptive way, I think the problem becomes easier. You're sort of making the problem simpler. But I think if we take the ODD as you find it, if you will, which is completely open, I think it makes the whole challenge of self-driving much more difficult. And I think that is where the juice lies. Can vehicles achieve that to a way that meets the expectations of society?
Yeah, it's interesting, Jessica, in terms of the concept of ODD, do we license human drivers in a similar way? Do we have any restrictions that we place on drivers, that they're not allowed to drive at certain times or in certain locations or in certain types of roads or in certain conditions?
So my understanding is I've got some colleagues that have adapted vehicles. So some colleagues that have certain disabilities with, they may not have arms, or they might not be able to use pedals. Some people have hearing loss. So of course, there's some adaptations in the vehicles that allow them to nonetheless drive and be licensed. The one that I think we're all familiar with is the duty to wear glasses. Sometimes that's a constraint on your ability to drive. But I'd actually be very curious to hear if there are. But in terms of if you get a driving license, other than the category of vehicle that you are licensed to drive, and the weight and the category, it doesn't say that you can drive on some roads and not others. That's what road rules are for. They sort of apply to all of us, and they tell us where we can and cannot be.
Yeah, and I think we had a discussion about the concept of progressive licensing that I think it applies in Australia, Nick. Is that correct? The idea where you pass your test, but over a certain period of time, as you get more expert, you're allowed to drive in more domains, if I understand correctly.
That's right. Yeah, a number of countries have graduated driver licensing systems. They seem to be very successful. They're often promoted as improving road safety in terms of giving you the chance to generate that experience, but where there are some guide rails on the amount and type of driving that you can undertake in your first year of driving. So yeah, certainly those types of system exist. I think there's also the automatic transmission license. So when you're only allowed to drive vehicles with a certain transmission type, as another example.
Yeah, and I understand some insurers for young drivers have incentives that they can't drive at night, or they can't drive on certain types of roads, just to again reduce the risk of exposure in that first few years of learning. Jessica, I just wanted to pick up on the other public places, because that's kind of really interesting. That's thrown in there, might be overlooked by some people. But if I was to drive into a supermarket car park, this is now no longer a road. Is that what you would describe as an other public place, effectively?
Yeah, that's a great example. It's basically, it's quite a simple legal definition. It tends to be anywhere where the public has access. So sometimes there's been cases about campuses of universities, for example, and how segregated are they? Because if you have a gate, for example, that only allows individuals that are members of the university to go in, then it would be a private place. But if instead, you know, they have cases where they demonstrated that dog walkers could go, or people running could access it, and that made it a public place. So yes, as if it's a place where the public has access, we suggest that you need the same kind of protections and regulations, because in the end, it's all about safety assurance and making sure that people are safe. So we don't think it should be restricted to the formal definition of a road, which is a specific legal definition, but we suggest also covering public places for that very reason.
Yeah, perfect.
And that's really useful. Sorry, Bryn, for the trials in London, where we were trialing automated buses. We're talking to the police, that was in 2015, talking to the police about, well, are we changing the definition of a vehicle, changing the definition of a road, and changing the definition of a driver? The whole thing was up for grabs. There's so much uncertainty, but that's why the Law Commission's work is so vital, really, just to give us more certainty around what's likely to happen next.
Yeah, and so Jessica, the other side would be if you're running a bus service, you have a depot, for example, or a delivery service and you have a depot. That depot, because it's not accessible to the public, would sit outside the framework. So any automation that occurs in that environment would then sit outside this framework at the moment.
Yeah, so Amazon, Ocado, a lot of the current systems, you have warehouses which can be vast and wide, and they have a lot of automation already going on. And yeah, we're not suggesting that we would introduce an extra regulatory layer on that kind of aspect. There's also mining, lots of different areas where automation is already quite advanced, and it has quite different challenges in that regard. So health and safety at work becomes sort of a key framework to make sure your employees are safe, and it's through that lens rather than what we are considering as part of our project.
Yeah, excellent.
I just quickly make
set off.
A point. I think I'm monitoring the chat. It's quite an interesting conversation going on over the chat. So just to qualify a comment that I made, assumption could also be that you're not assuming anything about other person's behavior. That's an equally valid assumption. Having said that, I'll draw a very left field analogy over here. We are not allowed to drink and drive in the UK for obvious reasons. And you could make an analogy saying that the reason behind that is because we are not able to perceive our environment in an appropriate manner. In a similar manner, if the AV sensors are not able to perceive the environment, why should an AV be allowed to drive? So you could link the whole aspect of, yes, there isn't any limitation on where we can drive or cannot drive, but there are a set of rules that we have to follow. Those rules don't translate 1:1 to an AV, but there is a translation possible, and that might lead to the concept of ODDs, it might lead to concept of behaviors, and some other aspects of it.
Yeah, super, thank you. I just want to drop back, because I wrote a few questions just around the topic. So we've just been covering how the UK Automated Electric Vehicles Act defines self-driving. Noblame Safety Culture, we've just described that a little bit. But Jessica, what would be the benefits? Why would a Noblame Safety Culture be required? What are we trying to achieve by having that? Safety is really the core objective from what I could read into the consultation.
Yeah, when I think about a Noblame Safety Culture, I think the reason we highlight it so much is because it's such a change from what we have now. And I think maybe that has not been as appreciated in the public discourse as Ninke highlighted as well. Basically today, when there is a casualty on the road, and we even saw it, to be honest, with the fatality with Elaine Hertzberg with Uber, everyone was very quick to blame the safety driver. It's true that the NTSB report had a look at the corporate culture and there was that aspect, but fundamentally, a lot of the conversations where we know the safety driver is watching the voice on their phone, and that was a problem. And most of the other fatalities that we've seen, they can somehow be traced back to some form of human error. And I think although people have obviously been upset and people are worried about those fatalities, I don't think we've really grappled with the situation where you don't have a very easily directly identifiable human to blame when something goes wrong. So I think one aspect of highlighting it is to really, clarify the fact that when we move to a system of self-driving, there will no longer be a single human who's the last point of contact and had the ability to avoid an incident anymore in the way that we do now. And so we need to be thinking about really an algorithm potentially, and it might not be the algorithm that did anything untoward, but we have to move away from the idea that there is just someone you can point the finger at and that you can put in jail. The penalties for dangerous driving have just kept on going up. The government has consulted on making it something that could give you a life sentence. It's currently 14 years. Okay. There's a lot of appetite from the public to blame when things go wrong, and we don't think that that same approach is viable with self-driving, because you have companies and entities that are going to be putting forward algorithms to do the driving, and they're going to be designing them and putting them through safety cases and doing all of the best they can. But if and when things go wrong, you cannot have as your go-to a criminal system, because they're genuinely, you don't have the same kind of behaviors. It wasn't the case that someone was necessarily distracted or drunk or having other impairments that caused the incident. It's more about possibly failings in the corporate structure. So we've suggested you do need accountability, and I completely agree with Nick. You need traceability and accountability. So where there has been misleading information or where someone has not made a disclosure, we think there is a place for strong criminal sanction. But where that has not happened, we think that things can still go wrong. And as one of my colleagues used to say, physics trumps ethics. So sometimes really with even all the best precautions and sensors, you might still not be able to avoid an incident. And when that happens, we need to understand why it happened and try and minimize the chances of that happening again. And for people to be open and sharing the best information they have, it's also better that they don't feel that they have a dagger hanging over their head, because they're much less likely to be open and honest about what happened. So there's a functional benefit of a no blame culture, because you'll get better information. And then you also have the benefit of using this information to inform the system of regulation itself. And so we can understand that in the scenarios, we hadn't accounted for an e-scooter coming in at a particular angle, and that wasn't tested, and it wasn't something that was within the frame at the time, and it did happen. And so now we need to be more careful about that kind of scenario, for example. And I know you'll come to it later, Bryn, but something that's very close to my heart is, again, also looking at other road users with impairments and making sure that scenarios really take them into account, because you can't just have a quote unquote regular pedestrian, whatever that means. We need to make sure it's really inclusive, both for people in the vehicle, but also for other road users.
Yeah, Nick, I think that was one of the points that you picked out with the ethics work that you were looking at, is the proportion of different groups that are affected by the deployment of these technologies, and how we might want to shift that as well, given that the amount of vulnerable road users take the burden, if you like, for our mobility at the moment.
Right. Yeah. So one of the key points in the definition that was on screen earlier was that these vehicles can drive safely, and what does that mean? So one of the first recommendation of the recommendations for the European Commission was that automated vehicles should decrease physical harm. But we went further to say not only should the risk of physical harm decrease, but that no category of road users should experience an increase in risk of physical harm compared to conventional driving as a result of the presence of automated vehicles. So even if we were able to massively improve safety for vehicle occupants, if there was an increase in risk for pedestrians, that would be considered unethical based on our recommendations.
Yeah, Yeah, and Minke, when you look at the sort of criminal and civil system, obviously the UK has exited from the EU. The Netherlands is still part of that. You have I think we've had discussions before. The legal system is actually quite different. It's predicated on different beliefs sometimes. So what's your view on this sort of no blame safety culture? And could it be something that could be adopted in Europe, and what would need to change there in order for that to happen?
I definitely feel that it could be adopted by European countries, maybe not the EU as a whole, but every single European country might find a way to incorporate this no blame safety culture into their legal framework. The biggest problem is with regards to, as Jessica said, the criminal liability side of things. You don't want to immediately look for someone to blame and to put behind bars, basically. So that might require some adjustments. For instance, here in the Netherlands, you have many provisions stating what a driver should or should not do. And of course, without a driver, who are you going to tell how to behave in a certain way? So that would be something that might be addressed when a vehicle is approved, for instance, before it hits the roads, to make sure that a vehicle will behave according to your regular traffic rules, basically.
Yeah.
When it comes to, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
When it comes to the civil liability side of things, so who is going to pay for the damages? Here in Europe, we mostly look at the Product Liability Directive. That has also been implemented in the UK. I don't know what the status is right now after Brexit, but it means that all eyes are on the producer. Has the producer done anything wrong? Is his product defective? So for instance, if a self-driving car runs a red light, does that mean that the car is defective, or was there a good reason why it ran the red light? The producer has then several defenses to avoid this liability. For instance, he can say, well, this is a development risk matter given the current state of scientific and technological developments at the time the vehicle was put into circulation, and we were unable to detect this defect. And then he avoids liability. But still, nevertheless, you have this sort of urge usually when something happens that you think of when you now have a car accident, you get out of your car and you easily start pointing the finger at the other road user and you'll try to blame them. So it will be quite a shift for a lot of lawyers to move to this no blame safety culture.
Yeah, and Jessica, even though we're outside of the EU, I kind of referenced here the sort of 1968 Convention on Road Traffic. So at the international level, there are frameworks that exist. And so how does what we're developing here in the UK relate to that, that convention that I believe that we're signatories to? I'm not sure if we're fully signed up.
Yeah, no, we're definitely fully signed up. And the UK's been very active in that forum. So the way in the UK, international treaties don't have direct effect like in some other countries. So for example, in France, treaty conventions, they have direct effect in domestic law. And so they need to pay a lot of attention to particular wording, and it's a very close relationship. In the UK, of course, we comply with our international obligations, but it's not direct effect. We need to import those international obligations into domestic law. So our road traffic acts are the means by which we give effect to the obligations and things that we sign up to at an international level in the 68 Convention on Road Traffic. And indeed, there's whole departments within DFT that are dedicated to road safety and making sure that our performance is improving, and that we're looking after the different aspects within the conventions on road traffic within our domestic law in a way that is appropriate. So it's absolutely relevant.
Yeah. So I think one of the clauses we'll obviously touch on in the convention is, I think, Article 31, which is behaviour in the case of accident. That we should be able to detect the accident, we should be able to stop, make the site safe, be able to, if it's serious or fatal injury, be able to call the police. Those types of requirements, and they are copied through into UK law. We have the equivalent of that within our UK law, as far as I understand.
Yeah, no, we absolutely do, and all the signatories do as well.
Yeah, super. So I was just going to pull up, I think I put together a little slide. What was quite interesting, the Convention on Road Traffic is obviously managed by, administered, let's say, by UNEC WP1. But vehicle type approval, homologation standards, technical standards is those frameworks, those legal frameworks are UNEC WP29. And I just wanted to pull up, it's very interesting, both have recently, within the last few years, put out some statements around automated driving and about safety of automated driving and their kind of safety objectives, if you like. And so where UNEC WP1 may say react to unforeseen situations in a way that minimizes danger, we see something slightly different in terms of the wording for WP29, which is shall not cause accidents resulting in death or injury that are reasonably foreseeable and preventable. So we have one that's kind of saying we need to react to those unforeseen situations, a bit like you were saying, Jessica, accommodating for other people's errors that they may make, not having so many assumptions about their behavior that effectively we would say is unforeseen. And another saying that collisions should be reasonably foreseeable and preventable. We should prevent those collisions. So in shaping the UK legal framework, are we using similar language? How does it differ? Which one do we align more closely with, or are we trying to accommodate all of them, basically?
I don't know, Connor might want to say a bit about this. I know he's been looking a lot at vehicle standards as well. All I would say is that there is definitely a tension between WP1 and W29's remits because there is some overlap. WP1 tends to look more at the behaviors on our roads, whereas WP29 is more populated by engineers that focus on standards and things you can measure and put numbers on. And I think the two remits obviously need to work together when the driver and the behavior of the driver becomes something that is implemented through a technical, a new technology, as is an automated driving system. And I think that is a real tension. And there is the risk that sometimes in crafting standards, say in WP29, the nuance and full breadth of requirements on drivers today are not necessarily fully taken into account. I don't know, Connor, if you want to add anything.
I'd just say that, yeah, there is definitely a tension there, that one looks at it from a far more engineering perspective, the other from a behavioral perspective. I was actually going to ask you about harmonization efforts, because I do know that there are joint meetings now between these parties and they are working together. And I think in the future, they will probably have to harmonize a lot more in relation to their definitions of what self-driving means.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely collaboration. They've been asked by their parent group to make sure there's collaboration there. I haven't seen anything concrete yet in terms of passing of information back and forth. And I think it goes back again, if you look at the, in the UK, we reference competent and careful human driver, or a competent, careful driver. That's kind of the definition for safe driving on the road. And if you fall below that, you could be classed as careless. If you fall far below that, you can be classed as dangerous. So, and then they have legal and criminal definitions, effectively implications to those. So really taking what does that competent, careful mean is one of those things. How do you filter that down? And I think we'll come on to that a little bit later in our discussion. But they're really those high level principles that we've used. How do you then codify those and turn them into things that you can test and validate against, which is, I know this is an area that Siddhartha is really focused on. So do you have any comments on that, Siddhartha?
I would say it's an essential thing to do, but it's a really hard thing to do also, for all the reasons that Jessica has illustrated already. Because when you're trying to define behavior let me qualify. When you're trying to codify behavior, and given the permutations and combinations that are already possible of both the autonomous vehicle and also the actors around it, it's a fairly high dimensional problem. So it might be that we will start in a fairly secluded environment, and then we traverse slowly across to a more unconstrained environment. Having said that, I'm completely on board with Jessica's point around the fact that we cannot assume that everybody will follow the rules of road. So it would be a delicate balance between trying to constrain as well as trying to bring the behavior of other actors on board in the same codification concept. And it, again, I would say if we try to boil the ocean, it would be a bit difficult. However, there are a lot of benefits from the AV technology that we can reap if we actually deploy it in a constrained environment. But that constraint might be on the behavior of the AV, but the assumption would be that the other actors could do all sorts of things. I think that might be a good balance to start with, that the AV can do a few things, but the other actors, we assume, can do everything that is possible. I think that might be a good starting point for us.
Yeah, I think it's really, I think what's very valuable is when things are written down. So that's, for me, that's why the consultation is so useful, because you see things written in words and then you can actually really interrogate what those words mean. And I've done the same thing when I look at the reasonably foreseeable and preventable. And initially I was a little bit skeptical on that, if I'm being honest. One of the examples given was, and it's not, I should be clarify, I'm going to talk about a Tesla incident that happened in a foreign country. And I'm not saying that it's self-driving, but it just as an incident that reflects whether something's reasonably foreseeable or not. They're driving along in the outside lane of the motorway, and a van upturns and ends up upside down on its side in the outside lane of the motorway. So is that reasonably foreseeable? And was that collision preventable? And you can take different views on that. And I've heard different views from different parts of the industry. So some would say, well, that's a very, very rare event. We wouldn't expect to see an upturned van in the outside lane of a motorway. And from that logic, it's not something that they've tested in their simulations. It's not something they validated before the vehicle was put on the road. And from that perspective, I can understand that. But if the object is detected in the road and it's detected, 5 seconds out, then effectively that is reasonably foreseeable. You have actually seen the object with 5 seconds, and therefore within that 5 seconds, it's preventable as well. You can take some action to avoid it. And so I think it's very interesting to look over what time frame do we consider that reasonably foreseeable and preventable to run. Are we talking about all the way back to the testing days, or are we actually talking about the current incident? Was this particular incident reasonably foreseeable and preventable, and what evidence do we have to support that? So that's what we'll be coming on to talk about a bit later on in the session. I think we've got 3 minutes before the break, but has anyone spotted any questions in the chat or in the Q&A that we want to handle just before we go for a short break?
You've got lots of questions, Brent.
We may have to allocate some more time to that in the next session. So, anyone in particular grabs anyone's eye?
The question from Eric Barbier. We want to. Siddhartha, I know you've mentioned you'd like to answer that live. I'm almost tempted just to hand that over to you to have a go.
I actually thought we'll all answer it, because I wanted to bring in the ethical side and the legal side. Because I think we could club Eric's question and Neil's question and Jack's question together, because it's essentially taking a manufacturer or AV developer's view on no blame, and if it's actually possible to expect an AV developer to say it's no blame. So I think the context of Eric's question is really interesting. So rather than focusing on blame, you're giving them a chance to improve. I think that makes sense ethically, but given this, the consequence of something going wrong could be fatal. I'm not very sure if giving a chance to improve is the right way forward. But at the same time, I would say there's a very important aspect that we lack in the automotive side of things is learnings from incidents. So if you draw an analogy to aviation, where any crash or near miss is followed by a thorough investigation and a set of learnings have been created, which are then implemented in the industry. I think that's the bit that would kind of address Eric's comment, but also be very beneficial for the AV industry per se. And that's something I think we do not have right now. I'm not sure if we have anywhere in the world right now.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's incredibly valuable. It's predicated on having the data to actually do that analysis, you know, to do that learning. And that's certainly the third part of this this workshop. Will dig a bit deeper into what data is required. You know, what's the minimum set of data that would be required to enable that kind of learning, that culture of learning. So I think that's a fascinating topic.
I think if you've approached the challenge with, you know, the taking best practices in terms of design, in terms of human factors considerations, and something that is completely unpredictable has happened, then you know, it is right for a no blame culture to exist. If there is fault and people haven't adopted those best practices for whatever reason, you know, commercial advantage, whatever else, then it's a different situation, and different rules may apply.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting with the if you look, when we put young drivers on the road, you know, there's a minimum threshold that they meet, but we also accept that they are higher risk and that there's a continual learning phase. You know, so it's not that they're expert drivers, you know, as soon as they get their license. And I know I was one, you know, I crashed my car 2 weeks after I passed my test, you know, the classic statistic. So, you know, for me, it's interesting, you know, should there be like a minimum threshold, which all AV developers have to meet, which is safety, you know, a safety critical layer, and then elements on the top are allowed to evolve over time, you know, but never going below a particular safety threshold. So I think that's something that we can also talk about as we continue the sessions. Thanks very much for participating in the first half of this, the first third of this.